Hello, everyone. This is Mark Manganello with the Bureau of School Finance with the Department of Education. This is a fiscal year 27 adequacy estimate training. We do have a couple learning objectives for this training, where one is to understand the calculation. Two, which is most important for SAU staff, is understanding your SWEP grant, your adequacy grant, and then where to find them on the spreadsheet. So if you're an SAU business administrator, this is your SWEP grant, it's column Q, and this is your adequacy grant, column Z. So this is the state cash. This is the funding you get from your municipal tax collector. So we will you want to plug that right into your budget as you build your budget for fiscal year 27. We combine that data here over in column AB, and that's important to state policymakers because state policymakers are focused on the total state funding that goes to school, and both the SWEP grant and the adequacy grant are part of that total state funding. Lastly, it's important to understand that this is for district budgeting purposes. It's an estimate. We are forecasting what we think fiscal year 27 adequacy is going to be. As you build your budget, you might want to budget 100% of the adequacy grant as we estimated, or you might want to budget 95%. So here in this column, you can either budget 100% of this grant into your budget as you build your fiscal year 27 budget, or you could budget 95% if you want to be a little bit more conservative. So some of this data is pretty stable. We're one of the most variable parts of the data that we plug into the estimate is this FNR data. We're basically trying to forecast poverty. And so for a town like Allenstown, we're forecasting 208 FNR students, which is around 40 some odd percent poverty. If you don't think you're going to have 208 students experiencing poverty as school year 25-26 ends, either through direct certification or application, if you think you're going to come up short, then you might want to be conservative and budget 95% of your adequacy grant, because under state law, you're guaranteed 95% of this number. So that's a local decision. For some communities, we'll say for example, Amherst, this FNR data is less crucial because you're not getting an extraordinary needs grant. Therefore, you might just want to budget 100% because it's probably less variability there as far as how off this estimate may be. But it is an estimate and it might be off. So those are the three learning objectives. So now we're going to walk through the formula. So the adequacy formula, the first thing we always calculate is ADM, average daily membership, and this is ADMR, average daily membership and residence. And also, you might notice that there's no school districts here. Well, some of them might happen to be school districts, but these are municipalities. We're calculating adequacy at the municipal level. So Ackworth is part of the Fall Mountain School District. But we are calculating at the municipal level because essentially we will calculate adequacy for Ackworth, and then we will pay the Fall Mountain School District, and essentially we're paying it on the behalf of Ackworth as a municipality within that school district. But then, of course, Allenstown is its own standalone school district, also happens to be a municipality. So there's cooperative school districts and split cooperative school districts, but we're calculating adequacy at the municipal level. And we're calculating where the student resides. So, for example, we are estimating that 57 students will reside in Albany and will be the financial responsibility of the school district of Albany. So what that means is Albany actually doesn't have any schools. Instead, they have 57, or we forecast 57 students who live within Albany and are the responsibility of the Albany School District. So those 57 students might be tuition to say Conway, another district public school. They could be an out-of-district placement to usually sometimes a special ed placement, which could be a non-public school. But what are the students that are the responsibility of the Albany School District? That's what we're trying to measure here. And so we're doing this through kindergarten through 12th grade. So this does not include preschool. And again, we're only focusing on what is the responsibility of Albany. So what is not the responsibility of Albany is if a student is home educated, they're taking the home education pathway, and they're not enrolled in the let's say Kennett, for example, if the Albany students are going to Kennett, they're not enrolled as a student of that's Albany's responsibility. They're home educated. There's home education aid here, so it can get a little tricky because you can take a course at a district public school as a home education student. But this also doesn't include charter school students. So charter school students are not the responsibility of Albany. Of course, there's special education students. There's that could be the responsibility of Albany, but Special education costs would be the responsibility of Albany, but we're not including charter school students in this calculation. We're not including EFA students in this calculation. So it's just the students, the responsibility of Albany. So as we do this calculation, we're trying to tally up all those students. And so as you can see, there's fractions here. Now these are estimates, but we're looking at the average daily membership, which means the way we do that calculation is if you have say you are an Alexandria student attending Newfound, and Newfound has a calendar of 180 days, and you live in Alexandria, we're going to say, and you only attend 90 of those 180 days, we're going to say 0.5 ADM, average daily membership, belongs to Alexandria. But say for the other 90 days of that 180-day school year, you go to Allenstown, then we would say 0.5 ADM, so 90 over 180, goes to Allenstown. So we are tracking students throughout the school year, so we have fractions in our calculations. It's not a head count. And so once we've tallied up those students that are the responsibility of the school district and reside in this particular municipality, we have the ADMR, and we are going to take that number and multiply it by base adequacy aid, which is $4,351 for fiscal year 27. These are rates, the space aid rate, as well as some of these other rates here. They all go up by 2% each year. So we are going to take 50 for, let's say for Alexandria, 200 times the 4,351 gets us 870,000. So that's base adequacy aid. And if you're paying attention to some of the Supreme Court decisions this past summer, the Conval order, the Conval court decision, the Supreme Court instructed the legislature to increase base aid up from this current number up to $7,000 at a minimum $7,356. So that was the Supreme Court instructing the legislature to increase the base aid amount. But the legislature has not, they issued that Supreme Court order right as session was ending. The legislature has not at this time changed state law to increase base aid to that number. So this is we will pay, the state will pay what is in state law for base adequacy aid. And so the 200 is going to be multiplied by that amount. But just for those being paying or curious about the Conval order, we will not pay that until the state law changes. So 200 times $4,351 gets us at $870K. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep looking at other demographic information about those students. And so the next crucial demographic data set is the F&R data, free and reduced price meal students. And so of those 200 students, we estimate 74, pretty much 75 of those students in Alexandria, we estimate are going to be F&R students. And to be F&R eligible, it's based on the National School Lunch Program. So to be eligible for reduced price meals under the National School Lunch Program, you have to be within 185% of the federal poverty guideline. So if you are within that 185%, the way the adequacy formula works is essentially measuring that, using that as a proxy for poverty. So if you are eligible for that National School Lunch Program because of your income, you are eligible for you are basically classified as an F&R student in our calculation. And we get that data set two ways, mainly. So from districts fill out, families fill out applications. If they fill out the applications and based on their household income and household information, a district would determine that student is F&R eligible and then provide that data to the state. So that's the application. What we look at is if the student is on SNAP or TANF, they're allowed to directly certify. If on SNAP or TANF, they're allowed to directly certify as F&R eligible. And so we also get that information from DHHS, and that's provided to NHED, it's provided to the school districts. And so those are two ways to be F&R eligible. And it's important to understand we're just collecting this data for the purposes of measuring poverty. The National School Lunch Program, which provides meals, federal funding for meals, and some state funding, federal funding for the actual meal programs in the school is a separate program. However, we are using that data set to measure poverty, and we are using that in the adequacy formula. One last thing I'll point out that sometimes tricks up districts is Medicaid is not a direct cert program. SNAP and TANF within DHHS are direct certification programs, not Medicaid. So something to keep in mind. And so Alexandria, of those nearly 75 students, if we're multiplying that by the F&R rate of $2,441, we get $182K. So of the 200 students in Alexandria, they're going to get this base aid, and then in addition to that base aid, these 74 students will get, or this district will get on behalf of these 74 students, $2,441, and that's so that's in addition to the base aid. Also keep in mind, this money is not restricted. This money is not, this $94 million that's to be distributed is not, it's unrestricted. So it's not restricted to be spent on meals. Sometimes people think that. That's Adequacy is an unrestricted grant to schools. Also in Alexandria, we have the estimate 200 students, and we estimate about 40 of those students are likely to be special education students receiving on IEPs, receiving special education services. So 39 or 40 students times that special ed rate of 2,229. The number is 89,000. So again, that's in addition to the base aid. Also, if they're F&R student, they would get, if these 39 students were F&R students, they would also get the F&R aid. So it's in addition to all these other components. The eligible Alexandria is going to get this aid amount that will go to the newfound school district. Also, Alexandria, we estimate about 1.7 students are going to be English language learners. English language learner is a federal program that provides federal funding for students who have English as a second language. So 1.7 students there, we estimate, times $849 is the English language learner differential aid. And then only 39 students or 39 equivalent full-time students statewide in this data set. But home education aid is what I was alluding to earlier. Alton has some students who are not, they're home educated. They are not, they don't seek to get a diploma from Prospect Mountain, which is Alton's high school. They are, but they might take courses at their district school. That Alton is hosting. So for each credit they take, they get 0.15 ADM. So if you have a handful of students all taking some courses at their district public school, we tally up that 0.15 ADM, and we estimate it's going to be around 1.3 ADM in students that are within Alton taking home education students within Alton taking some courses at their district public school. And so these are the major student variables we use in the formula. So we're tallying up all these aid amounts and getting the cost of an adequate education. So for Ackworth, the number is almost 500,000. So when we tally up all these metrics, all these rates, we get that number as a cost of an adequate education. So statewide, the cost is 817 million. That's the point of this exercise. In this estimate, we are predicting what school year 25-26. This is an estimate of what we think is going to happen for 25-26. So one of the things we noticed when looking at October data, we get October data from school districts every October. We noticed when we looked at last October to this October, we're noticing a 2% decline in enrollment. So we had 152,000 students last year. That's the full year. Now we're estimating it there to be about a 2% enrollment decline based on the data we've received from school districts. We're also forecasting a decline in poverty. So this was the F&R numbers we had last year. We are forecasting a 4.2% decline in poverty. And so again, this is a forecast. This is an estimate based on the data we already received from the school districts. However, if more students throughout the year sign up for SNAP or sign up at TANF or fill out those applications, then maybe we estimated, or maybe the data would suggest that these numbers can change. So keep that in mind. So when we tally up all these aid amounts, we get the cost of an adequate education. So for, I'll pick on Albany here. Albany, the cost of an adequate education is $367,000. So if we do 367K, we know we need to pay them that amount. But before we pay them that amount, we are going to check to see what was the SWEPT revenue raised. And so what the statewide education property tax, otherwise known as SWEPT, what that tax is essentially is the state says we need to raise at least $363 million, at least that amount, in statewide education property taxes to be spent on district public schools, to go to district public schools. And so if we're going to raise $363 million, we need to come up with a tax rate. And so that tax rate happens to be on an equalized basis, and we'll get into equalization in a second. It's $1 per thousand, essentially. So we have about $300 billion in non-utilities property values in the state on an equalized basis. So if we have around $300 billion, and we want to raise 300 at least $363 million. We need a tax rate of about a dollar three and 3 cents per thousand. And so if we get that dollar and 3 cent per thousand tax rate and apply it to a community like Albany, that raises $226,000. And so that is money that is raised by your property taxpayers, the property taxpayers, non-utility property taxpayers in the community, and it goes to the tax collector and then goes to eventually the school district. So Albany, the school district, is going to receive this money from their tax collector and sent to the school. And so since we know they need, for a cost of inadequate education based on all these metrics here, we know they need 367K. We're not going to cut them a check for that because we know they're going to also receive this 226K. So at this moment in time, the Department of Education, the way the law instructs us, is we are going to cut them a check for $141,000 because we know they're going to receive this money, and that's going to bring them up to the 367K needed to provide the cost of inadequate education. Most communities, their cost of inadequate education is greater than their swept revenue, what this dollar and 3 cent tax rate raises. However, for some communities, that $1.03 tax rate against their property tax base raises above and beyond the cost of inadequate education. So I'm going to pick on Alton here for a second. Alton, that $1.03 rate raises $4 million. And since it raises $4 million, that money is collected locally and goes to their school district. And we determined that their cost of inadequate education is $3 million. So therefore, the state doesn't need to cut Alton a check in state cash because we know they're receiving $4 million and we know they only need $3 million to have an adequate education as defined by the state. So what some people refer to this as is it's excess swept because it's a swept above and beyond the cost of inadequate education. And so their excess swept is $1 million. So you might hear the phrase excess swept. Sometimes there's legislation. There has been recently some litigation relative to this about should that $1 million above and beyond the cost of inadequate education be sent to the state? Sometimes you'll hear legislators talk about that. And sometimes you'll hear the term used donor town. And so if that extra $1 million went to the state, you'll hear those conversations sometimes in the state house or in your community. That's what people are referring to. So under current law, all $4 million goes to Alton, so none of it goes to the state. So they receive $4 million in the form of a swept grant in the adequacy formula. And they do not receive any state cash. And for a community like Alton, this formula essentially, the adequacy formula essentially ends because they have that $4 million. There's no more targeted aid or any aid that's going to go to them. So the next part of the formula, after we factored in swept, is there's some targeted grants. And so the primary targeted grant is the extraordinary needs grant. And the extraordinary needs grant is based on property over poverty. And so what we're doing is we're going to take your equalized valuation. This data set includes utilities. So all property values within, let's say Albany, they have $223 million here in property values. And if we divide it by your poverty, so for Alton, we're going to take or Albany, we're going to take the 223 million divided by the FNR students, we get a number. And so that number happens to be 6.5 million. So 6.5 million is their property over poverty. And so if you have a lot of property, so Alton has a lot of property relative to their poverty. So they have almost 4 billion here. So 4 billion divided by their FNR counts over here. 113 students. Their number is it turns out to be 34 or nearly 35 million in property over poverty. And so if your property over poverty is kind of high, you're not going to be targeted in this grant because it either means you have a lot of property or not a lot of poverty. And if your property over poverty is very low, it means you either have low property or high poverty or a combination of the two. And so you will be targeted under this grant. And so if your equalized valuation over FNR students is above 7 million, you do not get the grant. If it's below 1.7 million, you get a max grant of $11,730 per FNR student. And then if you're in between that, you get a sliding scale grant. And so if we pick on no one's getting the max grant because no one's under 1.7 million. But if we pick on a community here, 2.2 million, that's relatively close to the max. So this is Claremont. So Claremont's going to get, if we take this aid amount, this $7 million and divide it by their FNR students, they're going to get, we estimate they're going to get about $10,530 per each F&R student. So they're not getting the max grant, but they're getting close to the max grant because of where their equalized valuation over poverty lands. And then if we look at some communities here, let's see, closer to the max, we'll notice this community is not going to get it, but this community is going to get not a lot of money. So we have down here, Belmont. Belmont's not getting this because their property over poverty is above what requires them to be eligible. It's above the 7 million. But this community right here, this is Allstead. Allstead is really close to the max, so they're going to get a very tiny grant. So the way this works, that 13K over their poverty is 285. So they get, of course, more than $0 per F&R student, but pretty far away from that max grant. And it's because they're close to, they have a higher property over poverty metric. And so that's the extraordinary needs grant. Something I'll point out is that these metrics here, these what makes you eligible, the $7 million threshold and the $1.7 million threshold, we call this the ceiling, the 7 million, and then we call this the floor, 1.7 million. You got to be under the floor to get the max grant, and you have to be at least under the ceiling to even be eligible for the grant. So these metrics, including the max grant award, they all grow by 2% each year. So if property were to grow, would grow by 2%, this funding would be relatively stable, assuming your F&R numbers stay pretty stable. But property values has been growing lately. So since COVID, we've seen 15% statewide year-over-year growth. This past year, for this estimate, we already now have this data finalized. We saw 8.9% growth in property. That's the state average. So if your community is growing faster than that, or faster than really 2%, this grant is going to diminish in its effectiveness because it's basically based on property over poverty. So if you have declining F&R or declining or growing property, it's going to give you a higher fraction, and therefore you might not be eligible for this grant, or you might be your grant might be diminished over time if property values grow. So this is a variable that's you're going to see impacting potentially your aid amount. Now, if you have declining property and increasing F&R, you're going to get more aid. So something to track and keep an eye on. So the new grant this year for fiscal year 27 is Fiscal Capacity Disparity Aid. It follows a similar process of Extraordinary Needs Grant. However, this grant is it's based on property over all students. So not just property over the F&R students, it's property over all students and all students within your ADMR. And if you're under 1 million, so let's see if no one's under 1 million. Let's see who's near the max here. We have Charlestown near the max. If you're near the max, or if you're at the max, our max eligible is 1,250. Let's see what Charlestown has. It's going to be close to the max. They're receiving, not 1,200, but they're receiving $1,128 for each student because they have low property relative to all the students they have to serve in their district. So they're targeted, and then some communities are not going to be as targeted as much. Let's see, we'll pick on same process here. Let's see who's under 1.6 million. This one will be eligible, this won't. So this district is right on the line here. Rochester does not get the grant. They're close to being eligible, but they're not. Or this is what we estimate. They could end up being eligible. Effingham is, we estimate, based on their student enrollment data, they're going to get, it could be close to not receiving the grant. So let's see what their number is. It's going to be, $11 per pupil. Is what that turns out to be. So very far away from the max grant award. And so that's the Fiscal Capacity Disparity Aid grant. So moving on, we're using Albany as an example here. We know we need to pay Albany once we back out their sweats. We know we need to pay them $141K. We also know they're eligible for the Extraordinary Needs Grant. Again, they're close to the cap, so in the future they might not be eligible. Or if their F&R numbers do not reach the number we estimate, they might not be eligible. There's a line there as which they their equalized valuation over F&R students would not be eligible. They're not getting fiscal capacity disparity aid. But now when we tally this up, right now we know they're going to get for state cash adequacy grant, they're going to get $173K in addition to the swept revenue. The last metric we look at, our last component of the grant of the adequacy formula, is the hold harmless. And so what the hold harmless grant is major changes were made in the adequacy formula in fiscal year 24. And some of those changes were the extraordinary needs grant existed, but it was ramped up to be a lot larger component of the grant. So investments were made in the extraordinary needs grant, investments were made in base adequacy aid, and investments were made in F&R differential aid. And those were increases made. But at the same time they were making increases, they removed something called the stabilization grant. The stabilization grant was a hold harmless grant that was first calculated it and enacted in 2012 based on changes made to that formula in 2011. And so some communities in fiscal year 24 were expecting a stabilization grant. However, when the state made all those additional investments, sometimes and then took away the stabilization grant, some of those additional investments were not greater than the stabilization grant they were receiving otherwise. And so what the formula did was said, if you receive less money than whatever the difference is between basically the net difference between your increased investments in the formula minus the stabilization, whatever that variance is, a hold harmless grant was brought you up to level funding. And so that hold harmless grant was enacted in 24. It was also calculated in 25. And then in 25, it was the last year it was calculated. So now it's frozen here in 25. And what we did in 26 and what we continue to do in 27 is you are going to get 80% of that grant award, a grant award that was awarded in 25. So this metric right here, 173K plus, let's see, Albany has a 200K hold harmless grant. Their adequacy grant is going to be 374,000. So that's their state cash. They're guaranteed 95% of that amount. Just like all communities are guaranteed 95% of that estimate. So that is their state adequacy cash. Over here, we combined it with SWEP to get the total state funding. That gets us the total state adequacy formula amount. This is cash, this is swept, and that is the adequacy formula. Thank you.